there was a report out of Europe, conflicts of interest, corporate capture, and the push for 5G. And in this report, it's documented the conflicts of interest with ICNIRP, as well as other decision-making authorities when it comes to wireless radiation and 5G. And so I wanted to have a conversation with Susan Foster, Ellie Marks, and Cindy Franklin about the work that we've been doing in the United States, the work that they've been doing, and the issue of telecom influence and government regulatory capture. And then we'll be opening for questions. I just wanted to start out by introducing everyone, starting with Susan Foster. She is a writer, a US advisor to the UK's Radiation Research Trust, who we interviewed Eileen O'Connor last month, and an honorary fighter with the San Diego Fire Department. For 20 years, she's advocated for firefighters who've been neurologically and immunologically harmed due to cell towers on their stations. In 2004, she organized a SPECT brain scan study of 6 California firefighters who lived with a 2G cell tower on their station for 5 years. She conducted the study with Gunnar Hauser, MD, and they found brain abnormalities in all 6 firefighters tested. Foster was the original co-author of Resolution 15, calling for further study on fire stations across the United States and Canada, passed by the international IAFF, that's the International Association of Firefighters.
Right.
And in 2004, and that same study helped spur Los Angeles firefighter and sheriff unions to join forces in 2015. And we have a lot of these videos up on our YouTube channel of testimony on this.
I know scientifically that putting up these cell phone towers is safe.
But the International Association of Firefighters disagrees. They began opposing cell towers on fire stations after firefighters complained of health problems.
These firefighters developed symptoms.
Dr. Gunnar Hauser conducted a pilot study on firefighters at a station with cell towers.
And the symptoms included problem with memory, problem with intermittent confusion, problem with weakness.
Hauser says their brain scans suggest even low-level RF can cause cell damage, and he worries about more vulnerable groups like kids.
So we found abnormal brain function in all of the firefighters we examined.
So, following lobbying by firefighters, Cork and his co-author exempted fire stations from their bill, making them one place cell companies couldn't put a tower.
This is the first piece of legislation that I think anyone's aware of where somebody got an exemption because they were concerned about health. Did they tell you at all about the study?
All I know is that when the firefighters ask, you know, I do what they ask me to do.
Because they're strong lobbyists?
Yes.
So if, say, school teachers and parents had a strong lobby and they asked you to pass something that would prevent these from going up in your schools, would you do that?
If I couldn't get the votes any other way.
Firefighter and cancer survivor Tony Stefani notes,
it's not only firefighters, it's the people that live in the general vicinity of these towers.
Current regulations don't take into account continuous low-level exposure from these small cells 24 hours a day.
More of these studies have to be done.
There are 230 scientists from 41 countries who have apparently reviewed more than 2,000 peer-reviewed studies, and they're calling on the World Health Organization to do more studies. They're not convinced that this is...
They protested FirstNet deployment on their stations. Mm-hmm. The study was used as the basis for California firefighters fighting for the first ever health exemption to 5G and cell towers in AB 57 and SB 649 in California. And that was in 2017 and 2018. This is really the first time that we've seen exemptions related to health in legislation. Foster continues to advocate for firefighters to keep 5G towers off their stations and is currently writing a book on firefighters who've lost their health due to working in the shadow of cell towers. She holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Michigan. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Theodora. Like you, I hold a master's in social work, so I feel that I'm in very good company. I would like to talk my introduction is really just about my work with the firefighters. I have been working with them since August of 2001. I had helped defeat a cell tower in our neighborhood. And it was interesting because I was contacted by a neighbor. I was actually walking my dog and a neighbor was hiding behind a tree. And it was literally, you know, and I had just seen my son off to the school bus, and we always did this walk. So the woman knew I was going to be walking by, and I asked her to join me, and she said, "No, I can't be seen with you." And it turned out she was the wife of a telecom executive. She had cancer, she had breast cancer, and her husband knew that the tower that was proposed for our neighborhood was going to feed all of Rancho Santa Fe. And it was going to be 104 feet tall, and it could eventually be loaded from top to bottom, as we know the towers can be. So we were going to take, in our little neighborhood, we were going to take the brunt of the radiation to service a very wealthy community that was very close to us. And she said, "Can you lead the fight? We know you're a writer and you're a medical writer, and so can you lead this fight against the cell tower?" And my first question was, what's a cell tower? Because I had no idea. You know, I certainly knew what a cell phone was, but I had no idea how the radiation was directed from the cell tower to the phone and back. And so, I said, I'll lead this fight, yes, because it sounds like it would be dangerous to children, but I need to have the science. I need to have the backing, and I really don't have access to the science. Keep in mind, this is August or maybe June of 2001. Then for the next 6 weeks, about 2 mornings a week, I would open the door about 6 in the morning to let the dog out. And I had let the dog out the night before, and there was nothing on the front porch. So at 6 in the morning, I would open the door, and there would be an unmarked envelope, and placed squarely on the doormat, and in there was science. And so the science that's stacked up on my table over a period of 6 weeks, I had to believe, I didn't know for sure, but I had to believe it was from within the industry, and this is a major telecommunications carrier. And this is early on, and they knew it caused cancer. They absolutely knew it caused cancer. So I said, of course, absolutely, I will lead the fight. With the help of a union activist, we defeated the tower. Of course, as most people know, you can't defeat a tower based on health concerns. So one of us had to agree to do an interview, and Ellie Marks knows this very well. I don't like to go on TV. I don't like to do public speaking. And so I hesitatingly agreed to do this interview, and I'm so grateful I did. Fox News came out, they did an interview about us defeating the tower. And we didn't do a NIMBY thing. We didn't do a not in my backyard. We raised money, we hired Cindy Sage, and Cindy Sage went down and we had her educate our board of supervisors in San Diego County, because we wanted to broadly educate the community. It wasn't just about our tower. It was about what these towers are doing throughout the community as a whole. Then a firefighter saw me on TV, called me, asked me if I could write an appeal for them. And can you imagine telling a firefighter, "I'm so sorry, I can't write an appeal based on health concerns." Because they put their lives on the line every single day for us. They're willing to die for a stranger every single day when they go to work. So I had to tell this firefighter that, yes, I do have the science, and it sounds like you have a lot of the science too. And together that should be enough to get those 24 antennas knocked right off your roof. But we can't approach it from a health point of view. We approached it from a safety point of view, and that delayed things enough that the towers went elsewhere. But where did they go? They went to a preschool down the street. And so it was my introduction to working with the firefighters, and then I heard about the firefighters in Central California who had profound neurological symptoms, and as it turned out, neurological abnormalities that stayed with them because of the tower that was placed basically in the front yard, which is what we're talking about with 5G. So you've done the introduction mainly in terms of what has happened with the firefighters, and I thank you for that, because it allows me to close this off at this point. And that is that we did find brain damage. That was correct. It was a pilot study, so we could only afford to study 6 firefighters with these SPECT brain scans. but we did find brain damage in all 6 firefighters. One scan where we found the least amount of damage, that was the captain, who could move himself to another station where they didn't have the tower right in front of the station. So it was a great example for us that the more time that was spent there, the more damage there was to these men. And for that's what's going to be happening to all of us. I'm not saying everybody's going to be brain damaged, but this is one of the reasons I'm fighting 5G as hard as I possibly can, because these towers are going to be in our front yards. The firefighters had a 2G tower, not 5G, 2G in their front yard. And for 5-year exposure every other day. And so what's going to happen to humanity when 5G is rolled out in our front yards? So that's how I would conclude my introduction, more with the question, what's going to happen to all of us?
That is incredible. And I want to talk more about that. Thank you for sharing that. I actually didn't know the details from that. And I'll be posting later, especially for everyone who's on this webinar, links to the testimony that you put forward, as well as your submissions to the FCC.
Okay, great, thank you.
So I wanted to introduce Cindy Franklin, who's been engaged in wireless health and safety issues since 2007, when she was shocked to read a safety warning hidden in the user manual of her 16-year-old daughter's cell phone. Since that time, she's focused mainly on consumer advocacy and education, attempting to expose the wireless industry deception and collusion with the FCC. And she joins Environmental Health Trust as a petitioner in the legal challenge just launched in January to the FCC's recent ruling, where they are stating that they do not need to update their outdated 24-year-old exposure guidelines, and nor do they need to test phones touching the body. And I thought you might expand on that and your organization. Thank you, Cindy.
Yeah, thank you, Theodora. And I'm so happy to be here with Susan and Ellie and admire, both of their long, struggles, challenges with this work. And we all go on, So yes, I got into this in 2007. I bought my daughter for her 16th birthday a brand new, BlackBerry, which was just marketed at that time. So that was 13 years ago, for teenagers, women. They had colored little phones. The texting was great on it. And she started having some health issues, that were peculiar. And I noticed that she was texting all the time. It was in her pocket. She was getting texts, and I thought, that's weird. So I bought my first microwave meter. I saw something on the internet. I started looking at it. So I bought a meter, and I realized when the phone had sent a text even, it got this enormous burst of microwave. I could see it. I held it up to the microwave oven when I had my microwave on, and it was the same level that when I held the meter right up to the edge where the door is, it was that level of intensity. And same on a phone call. And I thought, what the heck? She gets hundreds of these things every day. It's in her pocket, right against her ovaries. She's 16. Look at her friends, these young men carrying these things in their front pockets. These reproductive organs are developing, and it only kind of made sense to me. I thought, what is going on? So I called BlackBerry, and I went up the chain as a customer complaining. I said, what is wrong? These phones, the microwave, blah, 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 my children, my daughter. And he says, oh, yes, there is a warning in here that you are not supposed to have your phone directly against, in a pocket or, directly against your body. I go, what? Where? Huh? And sent me the most obscure file that was on their website. I didn't even see it in the user manual, which they used to have in those days. It was on their website. So I just went on a campaign at that point. I started, complaining to the FCC, and I called thinking I'm going to educate the FCC. They don't know what's happening. Our elected, our hardworking government of people. And so I talked to someone who called me immediately back. Turns out, I didn't realize at the time, it was their chief legal counsel for their Office of Engineering. Here I am, just some mom calling. I get the chief legal counsel from the FCC. He knew, okay, this woman's causing some problems here. So this started a many-year campaign, mostly targeted at the FCC. I challenged them a number of times because I realized in looking through all the regulations and hidden in these legal documents that the FCC put out over the years, they actually require cell phones to be tested. First of all, they test it with a small separation at the head, but when they test it on the torso of the body, they allow the phones to be tested up to an inch away from the simulated device that they're using to test the exposure guidelines. They do have maximum guidelines, which are based on, we can talk about that another webinar, but because they allow the phones to be tested an inch away, they're saying people wear them in holsters and belt clips. They don't use them, women put them in sports bras, kids are wearing them in their pockets. They were denying that people did that. They were saying, no, that's not necessary. People shouldn't be doing that. Well, I confronted them because even on their website, the FCC says cell phones are tested directly against the body. They're fine to be used in any manner. But hidden in the fine print, they actually require manufacturers to put a legal notice that you should never wear or use the cell phone closer than the distance at which it is tested, which can be anywhere between 5 millimeters and an inch. But even at 5 millimeters, you're still getting a significant boost of radiation that's coming into your body. So then I started working, Ellie and I have been working together, she's gonna fill more in, on the Berkeley right to know, well, the San Francisco ordinance was the first right to know one that we started talking to elected officials to educate them and say, consumers need to be told. These manufacturers are hiding this information hidden in the legal fine print of user manuals. At the time, they were user manuals. Now, even though we've challenged the industry and they're aware that this is wrong what they're doing, they have not, the FCC has not changed the guidelines. In fact, in this December 4th order that we are challenging, they basically said, you know what, it's fine if people wear them in their pockets or into sports bras or whatever, because they're tested in a way that they could be safe no matter how they're used. It's like no legitimate reason other than the FCC says they're safe. Or maybe the FDA has made a statement that there's nothing showing that cell phones are dangerous. So I could go on and on about this. Theodora, is there anything else that you want to ask me to focus on in this area? We could talk about the Berkeley Right to Know Challenge a little bit, or you want me to just introduce that? Or
introduce that, and then okay. And then Ellie's going to talk about Burlingame and sort of follow.
Yes, because what we have found, and Ellie and I have worked hand in hand in this area for a long time now. We realized that that industry has captured the FCC. It's been documented. There are executives from the industry who now head up the FCC. So they're one and the same. Theoretically. We went to the Berkeley City Council, Ellie and a couple of other activists who actually lived in Berkeley, started educating them on the problem. And one man in particular took it on and said, this is wrong. He just put it out there. And Max, and he said, we're going to do something about this. This went on. Devra from EHT was there early on trying to educate the city council. This started in like what, Ellie, 2000, I don't even know when it was, probably 7 years ago. You're muted, but that's okay. I know what you're saying. It was probably 7 or 8 years ago. And so they put out a draft resolution. We helped them, draft this thing. Ellie was fortunate to find a Harvard law professor who agreed to take this on and defend the city. And all it says is the same, pretty much the same thing that's hidden in the phones themselves now that you have to try to find. It's the same information that manufacturers are supposed to put in the user manuals, the same information that the FCC tells the manufacturers to put in there because phones are not supposed to be used in pockets. And the CTIA, who is the lobbying arm of the industry, they claim they're a 501c3. They run a couple of other events throughout the year, but they're the massive lobbying arm. They sued Berkeley. And we prevailed, we can go on about this later, but we prevailed a couple of times all the way through the Ninth Circuit, through the Court of Appeals, multiple times. Supreme Court decided not to hear the case because it was pretty straightforward. That Berkeley was only amplifying the message that the FCC wanted consumers to know. And here we are. But now the industry is taking this December 4th ruling from the FCC, where the FCC says, you know, our regulations are perfect on the exposure guidelines. So we need to reopen this case about Berkeley. They shouldn't have the right to tell people information that's not important for them to know. It makes our products look like they're dangerous. So they're trying to get the case reopened. We have to go through all this again. It's crazy. Anyway, I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. I give a lot of talks to college students and university students, and when they hear that the argument that industry is making is the freedom of speech, that you shouldn't be forced or compelled to say something you don't want to, and that's why we're not being given that information at point of sale. It's mind blowing, really.
Yeah.
So Ellie Marks is the founder of the California Brain Tumor Association. And she entered into the cell phone brain tumor world of electromagnetic fields. And her husband was diagnosed with a brain tumor in 2008, which was attributed to his long-term cell phone use. She's testified to the United States Congress, and we have that up on our website as well, or you can go to C-SPAN, as well as to the Pennsylvania officials working on that, on the Dr. Oz Show, Larry King Live, The View, and many national newscasts. She's co-producer of the award-winning documentary Mobilize and a central figure in the film Generation Zapped. Ellie's traveled the country advocating for safety advisories at the point of sale for cell phones. And in doing so, she testifies against industry and knows how to debate their mistruths. She was one of the forces behind the San Francisco and Berkeley cell phone right to know laws and still working at it now. She believes strongly that consumers deserve the right to make informed decisions for themselves and their families. She's witnessed far too many to die because they didn't know to keep the phone away from their head or body. And she's not against technology, but she advocates for the public having the right to know the truth and to be advised of safety measures that they can take at the point of sale. And she's an outspoken advocate about government and corruption. And I'm so thankful to have you here to share some of your story in this conversation.
Oh, thank you. I want to thank you and EHT for doing this. And I'm thrilled to be here with Susan and Cindy, people I've worked with on this topic for years. You know, since my husband was diagnosed and I became involved in this because our son had worked for Ted Kennedy, who was diagnosed a week after my husband, and the Kennedy family felt that it was his cell phone that was responsible for his brain tumor. Since this all started, and I've heard from so many other people who have been affected either by brain tumors or other cancers throughout the body, I have witnessed collusion and despicable behavior by this industry and our government and many others who they have purchased, the likes of which I've never really thought existed. I knew how bad tobacco was. I think this makes tobacco look like, the tobacco industry look like teddy bears. So it's pretty bad and it's shocking. And here I am 12 years later and I'm still shocked by it. So the first thing was a few months after Alan's diagnosis and becoming aware of this, I hooked up with Deborah of EHT, Cindy Sage, and I then was testifying to Congress. the first thing I saw was the CTIA was invited to testify and they didn't show up. Congressman Kucinich was outraged at that, but the FCC showed up and I testified next to them. And when they were asked why they hadn't changed their obsolete, misleading exposure limits then, and this is 12 years ago, Julius Knapp of OET said, because you guys haven't told us to do so, and we don't have the scientific expertise to do that. So I immediately saw the finger pointing going on, and I think it was on the news that day in Washington, D.C., that the CTIA didn't feel the need to come because the FCC was testifying. So they're the big brother. Then I got more involved and I started working with Gavin Newsom when he was mayor of San Francisco, who heard about this issue and he wanted to do something. And that was the right to know. And what we were going to do at the beginning, we were working with EWG on this, and EHT was involved also, is we were going to have the SAR, the specific absorption rate, posted at the point of sale. However, this became very complicated because SAR is not a really good indication, and telling people to buy a lower SAR phone in the end turned out not to be a good advisory. But however, this is what it was at the beginning. Burlingame, California wanted to do what San Francisco was doing. Burlingame is a small town near the airport in San Francisco. And Michael Brownrigg was the city councilman. He had several friends who had brain tumors that he felt were attributed to cell phone radiation. So anyhow, we started working with them on this. And the night before the hearing, I sent an email to the Burlingame attorney, city attorney. And I said, I don't understand how the CTIA can stop the city of Burlingame from posting the SAR levels at the point of sale when the FCC website directs people to buy a lower SAR phone. So we went to the hearing. Dane Snowden of the CTIA was there all the way from Washington, D.C. in this little town. They had already threatened a lawsuit. They threaten lawsuits to anyone who has talked about doing this, including Arcata, California, with a very small population. So anyhow, he was there and he got up to present and he said, Mrs. Marks's email from yesterday is incorrect. Now, I don't know how he saw it, but he did. If you go to the FCC website, it says nothing about buying a lower SAR phone. So we didn't know what he was talking about because it was there the day before. So Renee Sharp of EWG pulled out her iPad, went to the site. Sure enough, it was gone. And down at the bottom of the page, it said revised, and it was that date. So the CTIA made a call to the FCC, who they work in cahoots with all the time, and they got it taken off so that it would look good for them that night. So, you know, I'm starting to learn at this point about this intense corruption and collusion. There's several other things. I mean, so many things that have happened over the years. We see the industry and the FCC working together to influence media, to influence neurosurgeons, to influence legislators. I had a meeting with Henry Waxman, who used to be a federal representative to Congress from the LA area. He called me himself and he said, I heard what you and your son are doing. I think it's great. I'd like to meet with you. I think it might've been around 2011. I'm not sure. I flew down there. I had a meeting with him the following day. I stayed in a hotel. A few hours before, they canceled. And I was really upset about that. And I went there anyhow, and I kind of felt like he was hiding in a closet. So turns out later, he retired right after that, and he went to work for Verizon as a lobbyist. So somehow they got to him. I don't know. I don't know how, but they did. Okay, so that takes us to San Francisco, which has been extremely interesting. We did get a cell phone right to know passed unanimously by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in, I believe it was 2010. It was to place a warning at the point of sale about RF radiation. So the industry fought this tooth and nail, and it never was implemented. And the lawsuit went on for years. And the city attorney who was handling the case, the deputy city attorney, Cindy and I worked with him. Deborah got to know him, and we questioned the entire time as to why he wasn't really doing a good job in court and things like that. We were trying to explain it to him as best as we could, and we were offering him experts. In the end, 4 years later, after they voted on it unanimously, it was repealed. And I don't want to go public with too much information here because I do fear retaliation. Tom Wheeler was head of the FCC at the time, and we know that he played a part in things having to do with the city of San Francisco and the Board of Supervisors repealing that law. So I don't want to say more, but there was intense corruption that went on there. Also, this was kind of funny. This is how they play. They play really dirty. And I remember the date because it was our 30th anniversary, wedding anniversary. It was June 7th, 2010. And the city of San Francisco was going to vote on the ordinance the following day. And my husband and I were staying in a hotel in San Francisco for our anniversary, and we were going to go to the hearing the following day. So I'm reading the paper. We still read a regular newspaper back then in the hotel room that morning, and I find a full-page ad taken out by the CTIA with a nurse with a stethoscope pointing to a sign of the FCC says cell phones are safe, the FDA says cell phones are safe, and it said, call your Board of Supervisors now, tell them to vote no on the cell phone right to know. It's not needed, it'll scare the public, blah, blah, blah. $30,000 for that ad. I wish we had the money to do the same. So they really play dirty. And Berkeley, which Cindy mentioned, has been really dirty. Larry Lessig has done an excellent job of defending the city of Berkeley and their cell phone right to know. And it is implemented. That's the good news. It was implemented at the point of sale in 2016, but they're still fighting it. They lost. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States and they lost, fair and square. The law is legal. It is constitutional, and they lost, and they're fighting it again. They submitted something asking for a rehearing of the case based on new evidence that the FCC is not changing their exposure limits, thus cell phones are safe as used. Not true. None of this is true. And just last week, the FCC weighed in on this and submitted to the courts supporting the CTIA. This is unheard of. So we're dealing with just so much corruption and collusion. And, you know, it begs the question, why are they fighting so hard against the city of Berkeley? And they know that we probably want to take this to other cities. In fact, San Francisco wants to do it again, and Burlingame. So why are they fighting so hard? What is it that they're really trying to hide? And in my opinion, from working on this all these years, it's the truth that cell phones, if held to the body and if held to the head, are causing different cancers. We have the science, but they are adamant that this is not the case. And I just want to talk about one other thing which proves this. The WHO website is incredible. In 2011, they classified RF as a possible human carcinogen based on an increased risk of lethal brain tumors associated with mobile phone use. You go to their website and it has that at the top. A paragraph or two down, there are no adverse health effects from cell phones. So I actually emailed, I think it was Emily Van Deventer with the WHO. And I said, how can that be? I consider a legal brain tumor an adverse health effect. And I got back more gibberish. And it's just incredible to me how they war game the science. They war game just about all of this. They buy scientists, and like I said before, even neurosurgeons, and they have them speak out about it. And the public likes to believe a neurosurgeon. So this is really disturbing that the public is being sold a bag of goods about a device used daily by children and just about everybody. They're sleeping with them. And it kills me when I see young people carrying them in their back pocket or in their front pocket or in their bra. And they just don't know, despite all the work that all of us are doing, we're up against Goliath. I mean, it's really disturbing. So I hope that helps paint the picture of what's been going on. And we do get battle fatigue, but we do come back fighting because of more and more people being harmed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellie. I'm not sure where to start. I just want to back up a minute and talk about something that Susan said, because I did not know that studies were dropped off at your door. And it's reminding me of the tobacco papers, which were dropped off and sent to UCSF professors Dr. Lance, who has testified in Berkeley, and I know that you've worked with Ellie, and it's all the same story, only I think calling them teddy bears, that was good. I mean, I think of it, I know that Lloyd Morgan said big tobacco, big tech makes big tobacco look like a mom and pop shop. I mean, really, it's almost like checkmate. They're in all the organizations, the WHO, websites, where I actually have written her as well. And I have in the webinar I did on telecom influence, how the reporter, Mona, I don't know if you've watched Microwave Science and Lies.
Yeah, Mona Nielsen.
Yeah, Mona Nielsen, where she goes and asks, you know, who wrote those fact sheets? Well, I dug up a video of Michael Repiccioli saying that he wrote those fact sheets and how, oh, they're still valid even now, presenting to a group in India. And so I know that when I first learned about this, and it's interesting the stories that everyone has, but I too thought, oh, look what I found out. This is so fixable. Let me go to my elected officials and let's just get this fixed right away. Once they know, they will surely fix this big mistake. There's been a mistake. Forgot something. Because I loved my phone and I loved my Wi-Fi, and I couldn't imagine that there would be something wrong. In fact, I know what I know because I researched it so much, because I just couldn't believe it could possibly be true. And I was met with similar black, you know, walls as I tried to get that addressed. But I guess I've got some questions that have come to me, and you can also put questions in the chat. But how, you know, I think these examples are really important. And how did we get to where the FCC is now saying that they don't need to update the limits, the 24-year-old limits, based only on heating effects, not on biological effects, short-term effects, with no research that even looked at children, bees, trees, birds.
Right.
So I just wanted to open it up and have a conversation about all of this incredible.
I think Cindy can really talk about that. She's involved in the lawsuit with EHT against the FCC for not changing their exposure limits. Cindy?
Well, yeah, I two things come to mind on that. One is they can't roll out 5G if they can't allow massive levels of exposure to humans in an environment. They can't roll out 5G. If actually, and you know, it's a complicated issue to talk about, and all of us understand this, and I don't know how we can explain this on this call in a really short manner, but the FCC guidelines are based only on the heating of tissue, when actually the biological effects in thousands of independent research studies have showed harm, DNA damage, neurological damage at levels hundreds and thousands of times below that. Well, the FCC, who is industry, they can't allow backing down their guidelines 1,000-fold. They would be shut, you know, we would still be able to have cell phone service. We could still make calls, but we couldn't have massive transmitters in front of people's homes so people could stream videos and upload whatever, you know, day and night, wherever they are. So that's the one thing that comes, you know, that is the biggest corruption of them all. And how they could say after 24 years, we still think our heating only protection is just fine. Let's just carry on. Oh, and here's the other thing, and I don't know, maybe Susan was going to bring this one up, but the FCC says we're not a science-based organization. We rely on our sister agency, the FDA, which really the FDA has not, they stick the cell phone regulation under medical devices. They don't even have relevant scientists anymore who understand and have researched this issue that much. So they looked to the FDA, and the FDA said, nothing to see here. It's all great. Don't look at that National Toxicology Program study that showed cancer. No, there were problems with that. They just use rats. So, you know, they do it because they can. They're getting away with it. Who's stopping them?
Nobody's stopping them because right now I think every major media outlet globally is invested in 5G. So it was brilliant strategy. Ellie's correct that you look at tobacco and it's almost as if they manufacture teddy bears, not cigarettes. Because what Telecom did is they looked at the tobacco playbook and they looked what went wrong. Because what went wrong was it 94 when the boxes arrived at Stanton Glant's office at UCSF?
Yes.
And then he wrote the tobacco papers. And so do you remember, this was televised, it was on the evening news, there were 7 heads of the different tobacco companies who stood up and they said we do not believe that tobacco is addictive. And they all said it in a slightly different way, but they were called the 7 dwarfs because they got up there and they all lied together. But the number 7 sticks in my mind. Then Stanton Glant, it was somebody watching that from Brown and Williamson, who was so tired of the lies, and they copied internal documents, sent them to Stanton Glant's, and humorously said they were from Mr. Butts, B-U-T-T-S, which, play on cigarette butts. But Stanton Glant's took that information public. He ended up writing a book called The Tobacco Papers. And then we knew that those 7 men had lied. So I think Telecom looked at that. What they have done internally, I don't know. I would love to get somebody who could talk about what they've done. But when you can control how they've been able to keep all of their employees quiet, they aren't going to have another Brown and Williamson sort of experience where somebody copies internal documents and sends them outside. I think what they're doing is they're segmenting the industry so much so that one person knows about one particular slice of data that they're selling to people. And I remember asking a neighbor, I had a lot of telecom neighbors in my neighborhood in California. And I was walking with one neighbor one day and I said, okay, tell me what you do. And she was selling something related to 5G at that time. And I said, well, can you, and it was still in advance. So this was a couple of years ago. And I said, can you tell me what, you've worked for Telecom for 20, 30 years. What do they tell you about health? I'd love to know. And she, I think, had kind of forgotten what I did. She said, I don't know. I think someday we'll find out that, cell phones are just as dangerous as our TV dinners. And she laughed it off. And I said, do they really not talk to you about health at all? And she said, no, because that's not my department. So I think you take a big pie and you slice it into 100 pieces. And the people in one slice don't know what the people in the 99 other slices are doing. So you segment the information so nobody has all the secrets. So I think that's part of what keeps it contained within the industry. But I think the bigger thing they did is they went out and they bought up the media. They started in the 80s buying up the media, and they continued heavily in the 90s and to the present day. So there's telecom money in all aspects of the media. Plus, they went out and they got media invested in 5G because there was a tremendous amount of hype around it. You've got, Theodora, we've talked about the op-ed that was in, the most recent op-ed that was in the June 4th Washington Post. That happens to be my favorite newspaper. Jeff Bezos owns it now. And I was very disappointed to read this yet one more op-ed that was extremely pro 5G and pro telecom. It was by Thomas Johnson, the chief counsel for the FCC. And what he did is he created a straw man. He was pointing, and a straw man is a fake argument that's easier to defeat than because you really don't have the facts on your side. So you're pointing the finger at something artificial. And he was saying, he wrote about this concept that people believe, this fringe element believes that 5G towers are causing COVID-19. And there certainly are people who are concerned legitimately. It's a fair question should we be rolling out 5G in the midst of a global pandemic? It's an absolutely fair question because we're increasing the radiation exposure. And what is that doing to people? But the concept, honestly, that 5G towers were causing COVID, I didn't really hear that. A few people might have thought it, a very fringe element might have thought it. But people were more concerned about the fact that we had vastly increased radiation in Wuhan, and we have vastly exponentially increased radiation 4G, okay, around the globe. So is that a good idea? So what Thomas Johnson did in his editorial, his op-ed, is that he mentioned that there were two actors and that they were the ones who really got this thing going. And now then these crazy people, these hooligans are going around and they're burning down cell towers. And he used a tactic that was used by Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. And Adolf Hitler said, blame the Jews because it's because of the Jews that we're not recovering economically. Thomas Johnson did the same thing, and I think it is absolutely disgusting. He said people who are against 5G are going to hurt the US recovery. That gave me an absolute chill when I read that, because I remember studying what Hitler had done. And so that was the straw man argument. And Thomas Johnson had to create something, because what did he have to offer? What he could have said was stop worrying about 5G, stop writing to Congress about it, stop going on TV and talking about it. All of you just relax, because here's a study showing that 5G is safe, okay? Here it is. But he couldn't do that for one reason, and one reason alone. He didn't have a single study. There's not a single study in the world, not in Europe, not in Asia, not in the United States, not with any of our agencies, not with the FCC, not with the EPA, not with the FDA. Okay, there's not a single study saying that 5G is safe. So you have the chief counsel, the chief attorney for the FCC going out and blasting two actors who said, they didn't say cell towers are causing COVID. They did say, is this a good idea? Okay, if you go and read their posts, they really didn't blame the cell towers for causing the virus that we know escaped from a lab or ended up in a wet market or however it happened. But the blame is squarely on the FCC. The blame is squarely on ICNIRP in Europe, okay, for allowing 5G to be rolled out without a single safety study. To me, that is the biggest global conspiracy that has ever occurred with telecommunications, because they're saying this is a weak signal. You look at Rodney Croft, who is the new head of ICNIRP in Europe. And the head of, people need to understand that ICNIRP is a nonprofit, German nonprofit. It's a good old boys club. You have to be invited to join. They're all telecom people who are invited to join. And one of the originators of ICNIRP was Michael Rapiccioli, who's the one who wrote the website. He's head of the WHO EMF project. So if you go to the WHO website, like Ellie was talking about, and you scratch your head and you say, why are they saying there are no known health effects? That's Michael Rapiccioli. So he guided ICNIRP, and he guided the World Health Organization, the EMF project. And of course, the reason they're saying is there are no health effects in spite of the thousands of studies showing adverse health effects, is because they are looking for three things. Okay, they're only looking at the thermal level, and we're looking at the non-thermal level. They're looking at, does the cell tower give you a shock? Does it cause heat stroke? And does it burn you? That's not what Cindy was worried about when her daughter had the cell phone in her pocket and was constantly texting and receiving texts. Cindy wasn't worried, was her daughter going to be shocked? Was she going to get heat stroke? Was she going to be burned? She was worried, are there neurological effects from this? Is my daughter going to get cancer? And is this radiating her ovaries? Isn't it the only ovaries she's ever going to have, because we're born with the only eggs that we're ever going to have. So what's happening? We're worried about cancer. We're worried about neurodegenerative diseases. This is all at the non-thermal level. This is below the heating effect. We're worried about Alzheimer's. We're worried about the increase in Alzheimer's. We're worried about very early onset dementia in 30s and 40s. We're worried about cognitive impairment. We're worried about emotional disturbances that can be linked to RF radiation at non-thermal levels. We're worried about the immune compromised. This is what we're talking about. So we're talking at one level, which is the real world level of what we're concerned about. And the FCC, the FDA, unfortunately, the EPA doesn't have much to say anymore because they were defunded in the 80s, okay? Their RF research. ICNIRP, the World Health Organization, they're all in cahoots together. They all look at each other and with very sober faces say, no known health effects. Because in their heads, they're thinking, this is the red herring. We're talking about heat. We're talking about burns, shocks, and heat stroke. And they don't tell us that their concept of no known health effects it has nothing whatsoever to do with cancer or immunological or neurological reactions.
Well, in fact, every study that shows effects is downplayed by ICNIRP in their proceedings. And they're what? It was 13 people? Invite only. The club is small group.
What the acronym is about the, correct me if I'm wrong, in ICNIRP, International Council on
International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection.
And the non-ionizing radiation part, you know, they're bringing up this decades old, outdated scientific assumption that physics, you know, properties render non-ionizing radiation perfectly harmless. It's not like the sun or X-rays. They always do this. If you look at industry propaganda, you know, this is not the same as X-rays. These conspiracy theorists out there talking about this, you know, they're really misguided. They don't understand the physics of non-ionizing radiation. All it does is just, you know, it's a little microwave and it heats up the tissues and that's all. It doesn't do anything. So it's the non-ionizing, they really discredit us. And you're right, Susan, the whole conspiracy thing, they ridicule us and make us, you know, they say either we're duped by the Russians, we're being used by them somehow to mess up 5G for the world, or we're just fruitcakes that don't know what we're talking about, you know. So they really have this, and it's in the media, and there are certain reporters that are out there targeting us as crazy people.
Well, yeah, go ahead. Let me just say one sentence, which is just that when we talk to media, they don't cover this issue. It is very hard to get any media person to adequately cover this. And Ellie, go ahead.
We have covered it over the years, and it's getting harder and harder now. I have been the target of some hit pieces by the New York Times. It was actually somebody I knew for many years. We raised our kids together. I was shocked when it came out. She used Dr. Bushberg from UC Davis, who's a known industry shill, against me, and it was really bad. And then there's even people like my husband's neurosurgeon that's gone up against me in media. So they do attack us and make us look like the crazy ones. I want to talk a little bit. I was glad Susan brought up the name Thomas Johnson. He's the general counsel for the FCC. And the FCC, as we told you before, has just submitted recently a document to the court in support of the CTIA against the city of Berkeley. Thomas Johnson used to be an employee of Gibson Dunn, the firm who is now representing the CTIA against the city of Berkeley. So that's an example of this revolving door. And the revolving door is incredible. Tom Wheeler, who used to be with the FCC, used to be with the telecom industry, all of them. I mean, I probably could name can't name anybody that hasn't been part of this revolving door.
Ajit Pai currently there was, you know, Ajit Pai currently there was.
Right. He was Verizon legal counsel. And yeah.
And Wiley Ryan, the law firms that are representing the CTIA.
Yeah.
And
so,
as well, Meredith Baker,
Mm-hmm.
now head of the CTIA, former FCC Commissioner Bruce Romano, former legal chief at the FCC, now at the law firm of Wiley Ryan representing the CTIA.
Right.
So, you know, there's a couple of things I want to get into. This is definitely, and Susan talked about this, a concerted effort by all of these groups, the CTIA, the FCC, the FDA. They just recently released a scientific review, which we should talk about, which is complete fabrication. So the CTIA, the FCC, FDA, EPA, ICNIRP, who am I forgetting? They're all working together to stop the transparency, to stop the public from knowing that there is damage from cell phones, wireless radiation, all these devices, these kids' porta potties that have a thing for the iPad in it, all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, they're winning in the public eye. So there are, what I failed to bring up before is there also are wrongful death and personal injury cases against the CTIA and the carriers and manufacturers of the people who are harmed. And so there's those cases which are taking forever. The industry is able to drag this out with motion after motion after motion. Different judges have been assigned to the case, and it's just taking forever. And so we have those cases. We have the cases EHT and Cindy Franklin have filed against the FCC. We have cases that several cities have filed against the FCC for taking away their authority on the 5G. We have the right to know, which is, you know, in the courts. So my feeling is they're all working together to stop all of this. And hopefully they don't succeed. But from what we're seeing so far, they have a lot of clout. Also, something we have to look at and realize what went into this was the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which says we cannot fight or cell towers or 5G on the ground.
Environmental concerns, so long as FCC limits are met. In other words, as long as they're compliant with the FCC allowable level, environmental concerns cannot be used in the citing decision as a reason not to. Now, a concern is different than a fact. I mean, just to point that out. And then case law came after, and it has been interpreted in some districts. So where when you go, your council person says to you, oh, I can't talk about that. We can't talk about health. Don't talk about health. We can't use health.
Right. I mean, that is just so outrageous that it just shows you how outrageous this whole thing is. And Susan, I think, brought up the Russians that, you know, that I don't know if it was Thomas Johnson who mentioned that, but it's been in the news a lot that people have been influenced by Russia about 5G.
I said that, but yeah, I'm sure Susan.
The funny part is that I think it was Deborah Davis, myself, we were working with certain reporters at RT America, and we were giving them the information. So much for your Russian conspiracy, right? So what do we do? I mean, well, you know, that's the question here. We need a whistleblower. Susan mentioned whistleblowers. I would love for one to fall in my lap, you know, like in that movie with Jessica Roberts. What was the
Julia Roberts?
Aaron Brockovich.
Julia Roberts. Yeah. When she met the whistleblower at the bar. I would love for that to happen. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, Susan is correct that they either don't know or they're silent.
The other infuriating thing is brain tumor rates and, for example, thyroid cancer rates, they are on the rise. And for some way, industry manipulates the data, the scientific factual data. And because they lump all the brain tumors, well, you can talk about this more, but, you know, they lump everything together. Or they say, like with thyroid cancer, which is really increasing because the antennas in the phones now have been pretty much moved down to the lower level of the phone. So even when we're talking about at the head, they don't have those long things hanging up there next to the brain anymore. So now it's like thyroid is getting it So these massively increasing thyroids, and of course industry will say, well, that's because there's better screening. You know, it's like they have something that's some plausible reason, and therefore our legitimate facts and concerns are, or more than concerns, our facts are whitewashed. And of course people want to believe the industry. They don't want to believe us, you know?
Well, you know,
it's working hard to try to get them to believe us instead of industry.
The CDC put out research showing that lymphomas are increasing. Thyroid cancer is increasing, as well as brain tumors. So the rise in brain tumors was not as much as thyroid cancer and the lymphoma among those under 20. So, under 20-year-olds. And that information is actually not in the database which the National Cancer Institute has up, because the CDC used a database that represents 98% of people rather than a much smaller percentage, which is actually what NCI has. So I just wanted to point that out, that one of the things that has happened is, you're probably aware of, that Yale Research, funded by the American Cancer Society, put out a report showing an association between people with thyroid cancer and long-term cell phone use who had certain genetic susceptibilities. And yet, why aren't we seeing that being promoted on the American Cancer Society webpage, which I have written to them many times now? Why isn't the CDC putting that up on their page? Which, by the way, if you go to the CDC page on cell phone radiation, which was changed, and that's a whole story as to what happened there, you'll see that they don't even talk about the National Toxicology Program study.
Right.
They don't even link to those findings. We do a lot of FOIAs, published information requests, and one of the things that we have, which is showing that when, like the National Cancer Institute, why do they have what they have up? Anyone listening on this call, go to the National Cancer Institute. Pretend you're just a normal person who knows nothing. You want to find out what's going on. What will you think? Will you even make it down that very long page? And while you're at it, see if you can find the National Toxicology Program study finding in any way for a normal person who knows nothing, in any prominent way. You'll see the way that they refer even to that study minimizes the findings. In fact, erroneously states them because they don't talk about the DNA damage. And it's hidden. It's just, you'll never get there in a million years. You have to make it through all this other industry-funded studies, actually, to get to that. And one of our FOIAs even shows that when Waxman's staffer contacted the NCI for information, the NCI didn't even give the full information that they discussed, which would have been research published by Dr. Hardell and Dr. Miller. That information was not presented. It was discussed, and they said, well, we prefer not to send that to the staffer. So what is going on? And I don't know, but I just know that there's a lot more that the American people and the people in other countries don't see. And it's like, we're so afraid to make everyone worried. Well, when I started on this in 2012, and you guys go back further than that, I remember people saying, it's everywhere. There's nothing you can do. It's everywhere. Just let it go. The genie's out of the bottle. And here we are with 5G, where maybe only the genie ponytail was in the bottle, because they're about to unleash this huge, massive, like even more. And look where we are. Like, you know, I've got children too, and they don't believe me because the government says it's safe.
Right.
That's
always been a problem. I want to comment on that. And Dr. Joel Moskowitz is somebody who works with us often on all of this. And he said many years ago when he got involved, I think it was 2009, that we need the government to be telling the public about these issues, about holding the cell phone away from the body and about 5G and all that. Otherwise, people aren't going to believe it. And I was guilty of that. I remember years ago hearing about cell phones and brain tumors, and my son was concerned. He said, Mom, Dad's going to get a brain tumor. This was way before Ellen got sick. And I said to him, if that was true, Zach, the government would be doing something about it. So I was naive and So are most of the people who are not involved in this. So that's a real problem, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
Ellie, explain what Joel did, though, having to sue the California. Yeah.
Well, Joel's done a couple of things. One thing was the CDC did issue precautions several years ago, and Joel realized it. It was on their website, and he made it go viral. Once it went viral, the CDC took down the precautions about cell phones and wireless radiation. So he's done that. He also...
it was the California Public Health Department.
Right, the California Department of Public Health. Someone that I know worked there, and they told me years ago that they had done their own research in the Department of Epidemiology on cell phones and brain tumors and found out there was a correlation. They said that the CDPH was going to be issuing a cell phone guidance sheet. This is back in, I think, 2010 or 11. And it didn't happen. And I would call and say, what's happening to it? And they would say, oh, it's sitting on so-and-so's desk. It's waiting for approval. It fell through the cracks, whatever. A few years later, I finally told Joel about it. And he filed Freedom of Information Acts, and he was shut down. They didn't get back to him. He had people calling him saying, don't pursue this. And he filed a lawsuit against the CDPH. And years later, I think it was 2017, they did have to release the document. They only had to release it to Joel. Was the catch, though.
And they had giant letters draft over the top of it.
Right. So Cindy and I and several others
we got our activist gear out. And
yeah, we went and protested at a CDPH 10th birthday party on the steps of the Capitol. We had a big sign that said California Department of Telecom Health.
Telecom Health.
Yeah.
That's fun.
We actually got the thing released in 2017 to the public, but people don't know about it and they don't see it, so it's not enough, unfortunately. But Joel,
well, I think the lawsuits are the only way. Wide open invitation to whistleblowers from the industry and also from the medical community, because the neurosurgeons are staying very tight-lipped. Remember, Charlie Teo in Australia was one of the only neurosurgeons initially who was speaking about the connection between cell phones and brain tumors, because he marched to his own drummer.
Right.
And but there's a great deal of money that is being made by the neurosurgeons because so many brain tumors are being taken out of so many people's heads. And this is an open invitation to anybody who wants to talk to me, to Ellie, to Cindy, to Theodora, because what is being said in the medical community that is keeping all of these people quiet? And I think I know what it is. It's the same thing that happened with Henry Lai when he and Narinder Singh discovered that RF radiation can damage DNA. And the University of Washington got a great deal of money from telecommunications. I may be wrong about the amount, maybe any of you can chime in, but I think it was 100 million or 200 million, and that was either money that they were getting or money that they were promised, but they were asked to fire or told to fire Henry Lai. Henry Lai was too famous. He was allowed to stay on, but he could no longer do his research on RF radiation. That is how it's money. That is how this whole conspiracy is held together. Mm-hmm. And so it takes neurosurgeons like Charlie Teo in Australia to say, absolutely, all I'm doing now is taking brain tumors out of young people's heads. But there is the threat hanging over surgeons that if they go public, if they go rogue, okay, if they tell the truth, it's a shame when telling the truth is going rogue. But if they go rogue, they won't be part of that hospital system anymore. Their practice will be destroyed. Their partners will be taken down with them. So there's peer pressure from their partners to be quiet. Mm-hmm. And so I welcome any whistleblowers in terms of what they are experiencing inside the world of neurosurgery. Mona Nielsen, who has been an incredible investigative reporter for 20 years now. And I don't know that we would have the 2B classification everything on the RF EMF spectrum, which means possible human carcinogen. That was May of 2011 with IARC, with the World Health Organization's Cancer Research Committee. It was headed by Anders Album, okay? Album is perhaps how you say it. Mona had a lead, okay? She speaks 5 or 6 different languages, which certainly helps her in her investigation. She'd been given a lead 2 years earlier that she followed like a bloodhound, and she heard that Anders Album had a connection to Telecom. Yet here he was, he was going to be reviewing everything, all the science coming in on RF EMF. So we weren't going to get any sort of precautions in the May 2011 meeting with him chairing the committee. She got her information in time, 2 years of dogged research, and she found out that Dr. Anders Album's brother was head of the biggest telecom lobbying firm in Basel, Switzerland. And Anders himself was a partner with him. So she released that the week before IARC was to meet. He had to step down, and then the vote was 29-1 to classify everything on the RF EMF spectrum as a 2B carcinogen. What was missing, if you all recall, what was missing from keeping it say a 2A vote that would have been successful, 2A means that you have solid human studies and you have solid animal studies. Well, what do we have now? We have our own National Toxicology Program study. That was nominated by the FDA, meaning the FDA is the one who said, okay, we'll put up the money. We think this is really important. And this was 15 years ago, 20 years ago now. Let's design. They spent 5 years designing the study. They said, National Toxicology Program, you do the study, set it up right. They ran it for 10 years. And what did they get? They got the National Toxicology Program results, right? So we had a strong animal study that was backed up by the Ramazzini study.
But what did they say after the results showed cancer?
Ellie, what was that?
What did they say after the results showed cancer?
Well, they said nothing.
Applied to rats. I haven't seen a rat running around with a cell phone. Have you?
No, I know. That was a great one.
Yeah.
I'm so glad the rats are cautioned now. But no, they actually said nothing. They buried the study. And it was Louis Lesson, the editor of Microwave News, who thought, wait a sec, 15 years. They said it would be done in 15 years. And 15 years has gone by. And so he put out a FOIA request. If Louis hadn't submitted that FOIA request to the FDA and the NTP, would we ever know the results of the NTP study? Our own government, if you want to talk about corruption, you know, I can talk a lot about ICNIRP, but let's talk about our own government suppressing the results, clear evidence of cancer and DNA damage. And we were going to sit on that. And if it hadn't been for the editor of Microwave News, who was keeping track, they would have just continued to bury it. But Ellie's right. Then they tried to whitewash it. The FDA, even though the FDA said, go ahead and study this, because they did not think that the study results would show the cancer. They did not think the study results would show DNA damage. So I think they thought they were covering themselves, and that they were going to say, look at us. We're doing the research. Yeah, the EPA might have been defunded back in the 80s, and no, we don't do any research, but let's bring this up as a great topic to research now. And let's fund it to the tune of what, $25–30 million. This was not a small study. And so to sit on that research, then it comes to the surface. Then there are different reports about what the findings were. And then, if you don't mind, I'm going to reference Jeffrey Shuren, who's an MD.
I'm glad you mentioned
We
his
should
name.
talk about the FDA.
He needs
Yes.
to be called out on this.
Okay, well, this is, yes, I'm calling Dr. Jeffrey Shuren out right now because he's the director of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. Okay, so this is the center that's responsible for assuring all of us about the safety and the effectiveness and the quality of medical devices, and assuring us about the safety of radiation-emitting products such as cell phones. He's the one who wrote the whitewash of this study.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that he's married to Allison Shuren, and Allison Shuren is a partner with Arnold and Porter, and they are a telecommunications, among other things. They have it's a firm that covers a great deal of legal ground, but one of their specialties is telecommunications. And so they boast on their website, we have guided companies. This is Arnold and Porter, where the FDA doctor's wife is a partner, okay? Allison Shuren. All right, this is from Arnold and Porter's website. We have guided companies through some of the largest mergers in history, advised wireless carriers, terrestrial and satellite, in novel spectrum transactions, counseled clients on how to obtain favorable regulatory treatment, I love that, for new technologies, provided regulatory advice to lenders and investors, and advised media clients on First Amendment and regulatory issues. So there's your conflict of interest, right there.
One of many.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cindy, you want to talk about Jeffrey Shuren with the FDA review? And it was in response to Anna Eshoo, a congresswoman from California, asking the FDA about cell phones and 5G and all of that and the health effects. So you want to take it from there?
Oh, so Dr. Shuren, we don't actually know who put together the list of scientific studies that Congresswoman Eshoo asked. Where are your list of studies that allow you to make a statement that cell phones that there are no health effects? And, and they couch the way they say that. There are no known, effects or, and so Shuren responded a few months later with a list. And it was interesting. It was anonymous. It was not peer reviewed. It was not signed. We don't know who actually assembled the list of science. It was cherry picked. And actually that list was then submitted as official testimony into the FCC docket, the proceeding that they were using to reassess their guidelines. Dr. Shuren submitted that list, and the FCC used it as the basis of their decision to not reassess their 24-year-old exposure guidelines. So of course, that is one of the basis for our challenge to the FCC. What else about that list?
Well, I want to interrupt for a minute. It wasn't just a list. They call it a scientific review.
Yes, exactly. Nobody signed it.
Nobody even signed it. There's no signatures on it.
Right.
So, but we did hear straight from Anna Eshoo with one of our colleagues that she was appeased by this. She says, I got the list. I'm happy that's the FDA. To say there's no problem with 5G, with cell phones and all of that.
She backed away.
So this is of extreme concern that the FDA is doing this. And we're trying to get media to cover this, which is very difficult.
Well, let me add one thing about the FDA, or a few things. So previous to that review, in addition to Eshoo, we actually had several scientists who were writing letters to the FDA and asking very specific questions, because at the time, before they put out this big review, if you went to the FDA website, there was a paucity of information.
Mm-hmm.
Hardly any. It linked to outdated websites. I mean, really outdated, like from 2010, before the Interphone. So we had been writing them and calling that out for quite a while. And when this came out, there were a series of several letters that had been sent to the FDA that had gone unanswered. Then when we had these letters from Congress, and it wasn't just Eshoo, there was actually several letters written after that first letter, asking for documentation on safety. Then they put out this, this long review of all the studies that downplays the NTP and concludes that there's no established health effects. But I think, I'll say two things. The scientists have then written calling for that to be retracted because of all the problems with that review. The way it was done was just and we have a whole video of scientists talking about this, was not in a systematic, methodical way that scientists would put together. And actually they say, I just realized this the other day, they say it was peer reviewed, but who picked the peer reviewers? This isn't a journal where you have a system that is in place, even though there's issues, of course, with the journals these days, but it's unknown who at the FDA wrote it, how they put it together, who reviewed it. And it's not actually an assessment of hazard necessarily because there's no outline of how they did that. But more importantly, is what that review does not cover. It doesn't cover impact to the brain. It's not a systematic review of nervous system impacts, neurological impacts like happened with the firefighters. It didn't look at impacts to birds, bees, or trees. Mm-hmm. So it actually, I thought in some ways, calls out the situation that we have in the United States where there really is no one who's looking out for the environment. And there's no one who, it's not about cell tower studies specifically. Mm-hmm. It's not about, so it's not in any way, I mean, how is it being used? And I'm sorry to hear that people in Congress are looking to that report as somehow proof of safety. Because if you actually take the time to read it, there's not, it doesn't have that. And if you think about an exposure to all of us and our all wildlife and animals and insects and the earth, it does not show that there's a protection. In fact, it shows that the FDA is really only looking at one thing. And so it shows the dearth of adequate review that we really need. That's what I think.
Non-thermal, we need reviews on the independent research on the biological effects at non-thermal levels, hundreds and thousands of times below. So a lot of those were cherry picked. So on that thermal, like the shocks and the burns,
Well, like what about the impact to bees? Let's just let's forget everything else and just look at the bees.
We're toast. If we lose the bees, human species, I mean, what are we going to
I agree with you, Cindy, and I would like to bring up something that I learned this last year working with San Diego County. And I met a gentleman who was one of the 40 or 44 men who went out in the country and did measurements and phoned them back into the FCC when they came up with their regulatory standards. We talk about safety standards. They are not really safety standards. They are regulatory standards. So they were out there doing the measurements in the field, and he said he never felt unwell. But if any of the guys felt unwell when radiation was being projected as in a certain state, a certain distance, then they would phone it in. And that, he said, that is literally how they came up with the regulatory standards, because the goal was to make sure that the United States was covered. Okay, so it had nothing to do with are we safe, had nothing to do with any health and safety studies, because they were out there measuring to make sure there was adequate coverage. And he said literally, they were, if they felt hot, if they got a headache, these were healthy men, because this is what they work with all the time. They're not men who are prone to being sensitive to RF radiation. They're literally phoning in their results to the FCC. Now so they got their regulatory standard, right? They found out what they needed in order to operate cell phones around the country. They were told, these gentlemen were told, and they're all thanked, by the way, in the beginning of, I think OET is at 56 or 65. They're thanked in the beginning of that bulletin. All of them were told that they would be called back to come up with a set of standards for wildlife. Okay, so that's the flora, the fauna, it's the birds and the bees. They never got called back. We have zero regulatory standards that protect wildlife, all the way down to the bees, insects. And Cindy's right, we're toasted. We have 7 years after the bees are gone. And so the absurdity of so much collusion working in favor of the industry and suppressing what we are so profoundly concerned about, and that is the increase in diseases across the board. And so I think it's not just the United States, it is Europe. And ICNIRP sets the standards for all of Europe. And
Not all, yeah.
Okay, tell me who they don't set the standards for then.
Well, there are several European countries that have a precautionary, like a lower limit, lower than ICNIRP. Russia and China and India have levels much lower based on actually, we can call it science-based, because India did that interministerial report looking at birds and bees and dropped it by a 10th. China, and they both have published on this, and Russia have it based on their understanding of the science. And then in Europe, there's Poland. I have it, I'd have to look it up, but there's several countries that have lower limits.
I think most of the European Union goes by, I know most of the European Union goes by ICNIRP, and this is their new head of ICNIRP, okay, Rodney Croft, who's an Australian psychology professor. He's not an MD, okay? Rodney Croft was just interviewed for The Feed, and here's a direct quote. Because he was saying, don't you think people are upset? They're concerned about 5G. They're talking about it. There's a lot on social media about it because you're not stepping forward and saying, here's a study saying it's safe. None of you are telling us it's safe. And Rodney Croft said, and I quote, "It's very true that the amount of studies specifically looking at 5G are very limited. But from a science perspective, that's just not relevant." And he's the new head of ICNIRP, okay? So what he loves to talk about is that he has very calming voice, and he likes to say, it's nothing to worry about. It's just very low energy. These towers are going to be very low voltage, very low energy. And he keeps repeating that mantra. And this is the mantra that's being repeated throughout Europe right now, and a bit in the United States as well. That's a red herring. It's not about the energy. It is about radio frequency electromagnetic exposure. It's about what the NTP study was about. That wasn't about energy. That was about RF, EMF, radio frequency electromagnetic fields. That's what we should be talking about. There is, for 5G, an exponential increase in radiation of 4G and 5G around this globe. So this is a red herring, it's a false argument, and it's absolutely absurd to say that we should all be reassured because this is very low energy. Not a single safety study. And I wanted to mention one other thing about health and safety and the absence of it. And I think how ludicrous it is that Thomas Johnson, attorney for the FCC, is pointing fingers at any of us who are saying we are concerned about the health effects of 5G. Because there is not a single safety study. And so I thought, well, let me call. This is last year when I was working with San Diego County on their ordinance and trying to get ADA language in there. And this gentleman who had helped devise the safety standard said, who do you know at the FCC? Because we had a number of questions that we couldn't get answered. And I said, well, I know one person that I've called for background, and that's Ed Mantipley. And he said, well, I know Ed. Why don't you call Ed? He is the one. I didn't know this. He is the one health and safety expert at the FCC. Remember, they set our, quote, safety guidelines. And so I called Ed's number. And I actually, I had the number directly to his office, and it got transferred someplace else, and I left a message for Ed. Susan Foster, please give me a call. He was the one person in charge of RF effects on human health. And I wanted to talk to him about ADA. I wanted to get my questions answered. Because I was tired of talking to electrical engineers, and I was tired of people who were just talking to me about, go ahead and try that, bring it on, and the FCC will sue you. It's an incredibly painful time to try to synchronize these every city and county's zoning ordinances to comply with the FCC directive. And that's a whole other session, Theodora. So guess what happened? So Ed wasn't there, so I left a message, and a couple hours, the phone rang, and I saw on caller ID it was the FCC. And Cindy, sort of like you got called by an attorney, you know, when you weren't expecting it. And so I thought, this is Ed calling back. And it was not Ed, it was Martin Doxat. And I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So if you're going to file something with the FCC, Martin's name comes up. And he is the chief of technical analysis branch in the Office of Engineering and Technology. He's the one who makes sure that there's enough RF radiation going to the different devices so that they all work. He called me back and he said, "You called for Ed?" And I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Well, Ed doesn't work here anymore." And I said, "Oh," he said, "I was Ed's boss." And I felt the same strangeness that you must have felt, Cindy, when you got a call from an attorney. It felt like overkill, okay? And it felt a little bit like you're calling for directions to the White House, and then the president calls you back, you know, to give you those directions. And so I said, well, okay, this was end of July, last week in July of 2019. And I said, when did Ed retire? And he said, oh, fall of 2018. Okay, think about when 5G's been rolled out, everybody, okay? The end of 2018, all of 2019. When did the zoning laws change so that we couldn't fight 5G towers in our front yards? January 1 of 2019. Ed Mantiply's chair is sitting empty this whole time, okay? From the fall of 2018 until July of 2019. And I said to Martin Doxat, well, who's taking over Ed's responsibilities? I mean, why haven't you filled that position? He said, you know how hard it is. And I said, oh yeah, just sorry. And I think the takeaway from that is that the FCC is in charge of regulating what we're exposed to in terms of radiation. They do not have one single person there who deals with RF radiation and human health. Every person needs to understand that. And then they say they rely on their sister agencies, but what they do is they collude with their sister agencies to suppress the evidence of scientific study.
Right.
So I believe the American people are being abused by this collusion. And I believe the more we talk about it, I think lawsuits like EHT, like Children's Health Defense, the fact that the two of you are suing the FCC is fantastic. And, you know, something came up, you're suing because 24, 25 years have gone by and they haven't lowered their safety standards, right? They haven't lowered the allowable limit of radiation. They haven't updated.
Well, actually suing because they failed in their evaluation of that docket of all of the information that had been in there since 2013. So they had 6 years of information. They ignored everything.
Well,
and
guess
went with the FDA's list. You know,
and the decision is not. It wasn't that they reviewed it. They reviewed the research and said, we reviewed it. These safety limits are fine. They said, we don't need to review it.
They said it was
there
actually
doesn't need to be a review.
And in one point they said, and there's no way we could do what they want anyway, because we would never have 5G. We would never have anything that works.
Well, that brings up my next point.
We have to close in a few minutes, so
Go
Okay.
ahead. Yeah, that's a good place to close. You know.
Well, let me share one thing that Martin Doczak said to me, because he wasn't expecting me to ask this question about safety limits. I said, since I have you on the phone, and since you deal with how much radiation goes to these different devices to make them work, I said, I don't get it. How are you going to keep the safety limits the same and still have 5G operate?
Mm-hmm.
I said, from a physics point of view, I think it's impossible because 5G heats tissue.
Mm-hmm.
And your limits, your safety limits start, you know, at that threshold of heating. And he said, oh, we've got a solution to that.
Oh yeah, I bet they do.
And he said, guess what?
What?
I mean, he was like a little boy at Christmas. He said, guess what we're going to do? We're going to raise the limits.
Yeah.
And I was stunned. I said, you're going to allow more radiation. You're legally going to allow more radiation. He said, yeah.
More heating. Yeah.
Okay. So then I testified the next week before the San Diego, on the 7th of August, I testified before the San Diego County Board of Supervisors. I had 3 minutes and I closed with that what I had learned from Martin Doczak. And I said, you know, all these people from the industry have testified that these limits are safe, but I'm here to tell you that I talked with the FCC last week and they're going to raise those limits. And Chairwoman Diane Jacob was very upset, and she, right at that moment, she told her attorney to get in touch with the FCC and find out what was going on. The next day, and this may be a giant coincidence, but the very next day, Chairman Ajit Pai from the FCC issued a press release saying, we've reviewed the standards and we feel they're fine. They're going to stay in place. They're going to stay exactly the way they are. So that is what he said. That is what he put into effect December 4th. Mm-hmm. Are they going to be able to do it? No. And they also know that we can't measure 5G, and that's a whole other story too.
Yeah.
And
that is a whole story.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something to sort of sum this up. You know, we can laugh about the collusion and all that and these stories that we all have. It's really pathetically sad. Mm-hmm. From somebody whose family has gone through this personally, to watching other people succumb to this illness young. Brett Bocook was 50. There's been people in their 20s that have died from brain
tumor. Farber, 28.
Rich Farber, just unbelievable. I could go on and on. I'm angry, and a lot of people should be angry.
That's what fuels us.
It's great that we're all doing this, and we have to raise public awareness and get more and more people angry.
Calling elected officials, telling them to do their jobs, and make the FCC be an independent agency protecting our health, not telecom wealth. How's that?
I love that, Cindy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it. It was fun.
Theodora, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Ellie.
Thanks, Theodora. Bye.